4 years ago, New Zealand entered into what seemed like a straightforward arrangement, a $370 million contract with South Korea to build modern ferries for its inter-island route. It was supposed to be a textbook case of international cooperation, an experienced shipbuilding nation helping a smaller country modernize its aging fleet. But then, something unexpected happened. Just 2 years after signing the deal, New Zealand pulled the plug. The government was prepared to absorb an $85 million penalty fee, nearly a quarter of the original contract value, just to walk away from the partnership. For a nation of barely 5 million people, that's not pocket change. It was a decision that sent ripples through the international shipbuilding community and raised a fundamental question: what went so catastrophically wrong? By August of this year, the answer became crystal clear. New Zealand didn't just cancel the Korean contract, they redirected the entire order to China, signaling a dramatic shift in who they trusted to deliver critical infrastructure. This isn't just a story about ships. It's a window into the changing dynamics of global manufacturing, the rising dominance of Chinese industry, and what happens when ambition collides with execution. Let's dive into what really happened. To understand why these ferries matter so much, we need to talk about geology and time. Lots of it. Roughly 85 million years ago, the ancient supercontinent of Gondwana began tearing itself apart through a process geologists call tectonic stretching. What would eventually become New Zealand was still part of this massive landmass, but the forces deep beneath the Earth's crust were already pulling it in different directions. Even as the continent fractured, the land that would form New Zealand remained connected, one continuous piece of Earth. Fast forward to about 1 million years ago. The Earth's crust continued to shift and settle. Sea levels rose and fell in geological rhythms. Slowly, the central lowlands that once bridged what we now call the North and South Islands began to disappear beneath the advancing ocean. This created the Cook Strait, a body of water that has defined New Zealand's geography and transportation challenges ever since. The strait isn't just any waterway. In some places, it plunges more than 3,000 meters deep. The average depth sits around 128 meters. You might think the modern world could simply build a bridge or tunnel to connect these islands, but the reality is far more complicated. New Zealand sits on one of the most geologically active zones on the planet, the boundary where the Indo-Australian plate collides with the Pacific plate. This intersection creates a landscape in constant motion. Every single year, New Zealand experiences approximately 20,000 earthquakes. More than 250 of those are strong enough for people to actually feel them. The Cook Strait runs directly through this seismic hotspot. Add to this another complication. The strait is where the Tasman Sea meets the Pacific Ocean. These two massive bodies of water create tidal forces that clash in the narrow passage, producing some of the most violent and unpredictable ocean currents anywhere in the world. Even in the shallowest sections, around 220 meters deep, the combination of seismic instability and turbulent waters makes the idea of a permanent structure economically and technically unfeasible. So for generations, New Zealand has relied on ferries. It's simply the safest, most practical solution. But here's the catch. More than 75% of New Zealand's population lives on the North Island, where the political and economic center of the country is concentrated. The South Island, by contrast, focuses primarily on agriculture and tourism. Around 800,000 passengers and 250,000 vehicles cross the Cook Strait every year. Some ferries even carry entire railway trains across the water. This transport link isn't just convenient, it's essential. And by the 2010s, it was showing serious signs of strain. The 3 ferries operated by Kiwi Rail, New Zealand's state-owned railway company, were falling apart. The oldest vessel in the fleet was commissioned back in 1988. The average age across all 3 ships had reached 31 years. In shipbuilding terms, that's ancient. These weren't just vintage vessels with character. They were mechanical time bombs with outdated equipment, frequent breakdowns, and a troubling safety record. In 2013, one of the ferries, the Eritrea, lost a propeller mid-crossing due to metal fatigue. It happened during the busy summer season, forcing the vessel out of service when demand was at its peak. A decade later, in February 2023, the same ship suffered a complete power failure while navigating the strait. But the most alarming incident came in January 2023. The Qatar ferry, traveling from Picton to Wellington with roughly 850 passengers aboard, suddenly lost power in all of its main engines. The vessel went adrift, slowly being pushed by currents toward the rocky shore. For the people on board, it must have been terrifying. A helpless drift in one of the world's most dangerous waterways. Disaster was only narrowly avoided. These weren't isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a fleet that had exceeded its operational lifespan. Maintenance costs were skyrocketing. Service interruptions had become routine, and the risk of a genuine catastrophe was growing with each crossing. Something had to change. Kiwi Rail knew it. The government knew it. And in 2020, they launched what they hoped would be the solution: the IREX project. South Korea seemed like the obvious choice. For decades, South Korea had been one of the world's shipbuilding superpowers. The government had designated shipbuilding as a strategic national industry back in the 1970s as part of its heavy and chemical industrialization drive. The investment paid off spectacularly. By 1993, South Korean shipyards were taking more orders than Japan, a milestone that marked the country's arrival as a global force. Three giants dominated the industry: Hyundai Heavy Industries, Samsung Heavy Industries, and Daewoo Shipbuilding and Marine Engineering. Among them, Hyundai wasn't just building commercial vessels. It was designing and constructing advanced naval ships for South Korea's military. By 2018, South Korea commanded an astounding 44% of the global shipbuilding market. So when New Zealand opened an international tender for two large rail-enabled ferries, selecting South Korea's Hyundai Mipo dockyard seemed like a safe bet. The contract was valued at $370 million. The specifications were ambitious but achievable. Each ferry would carry 1,500 passengers and 40 railway carriages, powered by dual-fuel propulsion systems that met rigorous environmental and safety standards. Delivery was scheduled for 2026. The New Zealand government had allocated a total budget of $800 million, not just for the ships themselves, but also for upgrading the port facilities in Wellington and Picton to accommodate the new vessels. Then the problem started. When the Korean design team delivered their blueprints, New Zealand officials realized something alarming. The ships were far larger than anticipated. The planned port upgrades were suddenly inadequate. To accommodate vessels of this size, both ports would require massive, expensive expansions. The project budget exploded from $800 million to $2.3 billion, nearly triple the original estimate. For a newly elected government focused on fiscal restraint, this was politically untenable. But the cost overrun wasn't even the worst part. By 2023, New Zealand had already paid $44 million in installments to the Korean shipyard. According to the original timeline, construction should have been well underway, with the first vessel scheduled for delivery in 2024. But when government officials asked for a status update, they got vague answers. There was no clear start date for construction, no tangible progress. The project was essentially frozen. New Zealand was paying for ships that existed only on paper. Transport Minister Winston Peters didn't mince words when announcing the cancellation. He told the press that terminating the IREX project would save taxpayers billions in financial pressure. But the real frustration was clear. The government had invested money and received nothing in return. To exit the contract, New Zealand paid an additional $144 million in settlement fees, on top of the $44 million already spent. Total loss, nearly $200 million, and they still didn't have a single new ferry. Despite the setback, the problem hadn't gone away. New Zealand's aging ferries were still breaking down with alarming regularity. In July of this year, another malfunction sparked nationwide concern. The inter-island link couldn't wait any longer. This time, New Zealand looked east, not to South Korea, but to China. In August, the government officially announced that the two large ferry orders would be transferred to Chinese shipyards. While the exact contract value is still being negotiated, New Zealand has set a target delivery date of 2029. The decision might surprise some observers, but the data tells a compelling story. China has been the world's #1 shipbuilding nation for 13 consecutive years. In just the first half of 2025, Chinese shipyards accounted for more than 47% of global completed shipbuilding and new orders. Their share of new orders alone reached an extraordinary 64%. But the numbers only tell part of the story. What's changed is China's approach to design flexibility. Modern Chinese-built vessels are increasingly designed to be under 200 meters in length, a specification that allows ports to accommodate them with only minor upgrades. This directly addresses the budget catastrophe that New Zealand experienced with the Korean design. Instead of requiring multi-billion-dollar port expansions, the new ships can work within existing infrastructure constraints. This represents a fundamental shift in how shipbuilding contracts are approached. Instead of forcing clients to adapt their infrastructure to the ship, Chinese yards are adapting the ship to the client's infrastructure. China's rise to the top of the shipbuilding world wasn't overnight, but it was remarkably swift. In 2010, China surpassed South Korea for the first time across all three major shipbuilding indicators: completed tonnage, new orders, and order backlog. It was a symbolic moment, the official entry of China into the elite ranks of global shipbuilding powers. For the next decade, China and South Korea engaged in fierce competition, trading the top position back and forth. But by 2021, something changed. China began to pull decisively ahead. According to 2024 data, global shipyards received a total of 2,390 new ship orders. Chinese yards captured 70% of that market, a dominance that would have seemed impossible just 20 years earlier. Meanwhile, South Korea's influence has been steadily eroding. Part of the problem is strategic Korean shipbuilders have focused heavily on standardized, mass-market vessels while struggling to design specialized ships tailored to specific client needs. The New Zealand contract is a perfect example of this limitation. The Korean design was technically impressive, but practically incompatible with the client's infrastructure constraints. There's another factor at play. In pursuit of higher profit margins, some South Korean builders have pushed cost-cutting measures that have led to safety concerns and vessel-related incidents. These problems have damaged the industry's reputation in international markets. Perhaps most critically, South Korea's shipbuilding sector has become heavily dependent on geopolitical alignment with the United States. When American policymakers have investigated or targeted China's shipbuilding industry, South Korea has sometimes sacrificed trade relationships with China to maintain that alliance. The irony is that South Korea itself relies heavily on China for critical raw materials like steel. When diplomatic tensions rise, supply chains become unstable, production schedules slip, and costs increase. New Zealand isn't alone in this shift. Qatar, once a major client of South Korea's shipbuilding industry, made a similar move in 2024. Qatar Energy signed a deal with China State Shipbuilding Corporation for 18 ultra-large LNG carriers. Each vessel has a capacity of 271,000 cubic meters. The total contract value, $5.5 billion. Qatar's reasoning was straightforward. Chinese shipyards now have the technical capability and production capacity to handle massive, high-specification projects that once would have automatically gone to South Korea or Japan. Even Denmark's Maersk, one of the world's largest shipping companies, has been steadily increasing its orders with Chinese shipyards in recent years. This trend isn't driven by politics or sentiment. It's driven by performance, reliability, and competitive pricing. The story of New Zealand's ferry contract is about more than ships. It's a case study in how global manufacturing leadership changes hands. For decades, the narrative was simple. South Korea and Japan dominated high-tech manufacturing and shipbuilding, while China focused on volume and lower-cost production. But that distinction has been eroding for years. China has moved steadily up the value chain, not just building more ships, but building better ships, more complex ships, and ships specifically tailored to client needs. The New Zealand government's decision to abandon a contract midstream and absorb a $200 million loss speaks to how dramatically the calculation has shifted. They didn't just want ships. They wanted ships that fit their infrastructure, their budget, and their timeline. South Korea, for all its experience, couldn't deliver that. China could. This isn't the end of South Korea's shipbuilding industry, but it is a warning sign. In a globalized market where clients have choices, execution matters more than reputation. Flexibility matters more than tradition. And the ability to deliver on time and on budget matters more than anything else. As New Zealand awaits its new ferries, scheduled for delivery in 2029, the Cook Strait will continue to see the same aging vessels making their daily crossings, carrying passengers and cargo across one of the world's most challenging waterways. But when those new Chinese-built ferries finally arrive, they'll represent more than just upgraded transportation. They'll be a floating symbol of a world in transition, where the old certainties of who builds what are giving way to new realities, and where trust is earned through performance, not inherited through history. The question now isn't whether China can compete in global shipbuilding. The question is whether anyone else can keep up.